So the cell membrane controls the substances that enter and exit the cell. In terms of this cell, you can draw your little cell very simply. Just put a circle with a nucleus in the middle. And then there's a circle on the inside to represent that cell membrane. The outside could be maybe a cell wall if we're talking about a plant cell. Let's not worry too much about it. And this label here is essentially describing the fluid that exists outside of the cells. If we're talking about single-celled structures like an amoeba, the extracellular fluid could be just the water in which it's living in. If we're talking about complex organisms like human beings, there is fluid that exists in between the adjacent cells. And that's called extracellular fluid. Extra not implying that there's like too much fluid in the cell and it's extra, but extra just means outside of, like exit, all right? So extracellular, outside of the cell. Fluid that exists outside of the cell, all right? So our cell exists in this situation where there's fluid on the outside and then the fluid on the inside, the cytoplasm. And that cell membrane kind of acts as the, the gatekeeper, keeping things from moving in and out, or allowing things from moving in and out. Okay, two main methods of transport. And I wouldn't necessarily put this top box. If we're trying to cut down on the amount we want to write, and you know what, I find sometimes these are a little too wordy, you can put that title, two main methods of transport. One, passive transport, and two, active transport. That first top box essentially says what the title said there. Yeah, we do want you to put it, it's just a little definition. Passive transport does not require the input of energy. It happens all on its own. And active transport does require the cell to give up some energy. It costs the cell in terms of energy. Right, because like passive transport, if you're passive, then yeah, you let things go by. Yeah, that's fine. I'm not going to get too excited about it. Passive means not participating, right? Not having to do anything. So passive transport just happens all on its own. The laws of physics govern it. Well, laws of physics govern everything, but that's what kind of, that's what drives it. Active transport, the cell is doing something to transport something, and that takes energy. Are we okay with the difference between passive and active? Passive, you're not doing much. Active, the cell is doing something in order to make that happen. Okay. So let's talk about passive transport then. So now we'll go into detail on these two different types. Don't write down this ball rolling down a hill or walking through the city limits. I'm not even a fan of the walking through the city limits. I should have deleted it away. I'll talk about the ball rolling down a hill situation. So when these two types take place, diffusion and osmosis, the cell doesn't have to use any of its energy that maybe it has stored for whatever it's going to do. So now diffusion and osmosis, and I'll define these these particular things in a moment. Diffusion you may have heard about before. It's kind of the spontaneous spreading of one type of fluid in another type of fluid. And actually we're looking at diffusion here with our T scenario, right? And diffusion has everything to do with the particles around it bumping into the colored particles or whatever the other particles is and kind of getting them to spread out and move around, all right? We encounter diffusion this is obviously liquids, right? So we've got a liquid, the T, that's kind of dissolved in the other liquid, the water, and due to this diffusion, it's spreading out. The particles are bumping into each other and they're pushing each other around. Diffusion can take place in the air as well. Air is a fluid. It's a fluid substance. It can flow. And if someone, you know...
Excuse me?
Yep.
Can you get your attendance to the office, please?
Yep.
Thank you.
If someone is a little generous with, let's say, the axe, you know what I'm talking about, in the hallway every once in a while, these guys, who knows why they do that. And it doesn't take long for the entire hall to be filled with that oh so pungent odor of the axe. And no one had to do anything for that. It just happens by itself. And again, it's the random movement of the air particles that are bumping into the axe particles that cause them to spread out. Now this happens spontaneously. In physics and in chemistry, we use the term spontaneous to describe a process that doesn't need any input of energy. It just happens. It happens because of the nature and the laws of physics. Just like when you have, say, a ball or a rock, and you have it at the top of a hill, maybe on the side of the hill, and you let it go, it takes no energy to have that ball roll down the hill. It just does it. Why? Because the laws of physics dictate that that ball at a higher energy would rather exist as a ball in a lower energy state, and so it rolls down the hill. All right? That's exactly what happens in diffusion. It's what we call a spontaneous process, and it happens all by itself. All right? Okay. So let's write a little bit about what diffusion is. It is the movement of uncharged particles. Uncharged, it simply means they're not ions. From an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration until an equilibrium is reached. Equilibrium is only when the concentrations are nice and uniform. Then diffusion stops. Food and O2 diffuse into the cells across the cell membrane, and C2O and waste diffuse out. Big molecules cannot diffuse. Diffusion is caused by the particles that the substance is dissolved in bumping into those other particles and moving them around. Let's see if I can come up with an analogy for you. Let's say you were at a rock concert or a dance of some sort, and there was a large crowd of students or kids or who knows what, packed up towards the stage, just rocking out there, having a grand old time. And they're all packed together, all moving around with the music, right? Those students, people, moving around are kind of like the water in my demonstration here, or perhaps the air particles, if I'm talking about my axe demonstration, right? Which wasn't really a demonstration, thought experiment. So let's say everybody's rocking away and they're just moving around, just like the water molecules do. They kind of shake and vibrate around, same with the air molecules because they've got energy in them. And let's say then a bunch of balloons were released into the audience, kind of close to the stage, and all the key people and the kids are hitting the balloons, and the balloons would all fly up into the air and they'd start to move, right? And they'd move because of the movement of the people. Eventually those balloons would be hit in all different directions, and the balloons would spread out amongst the crowd because they're being hit in all different directions by the moving people. That's exactly what's happening when we have diffusion here, all right? The water molecules are bumping into the T molecules, and they're simply pushing them around randomly. So where there are no T particles, eventually the water molecules bump them into that area where there's no T particles, all right? If it's hotter, the faster the water molecules are vibrating, the faster diffusion can take place. Notice my tea that I didn't have in the nice warm water. It's slowly diffusing, but not nearly as quickly as this. That'd be like having a fast song and all the students, dancing faster, causing the balloons to move faster, all right? If you were to then, instead of have balloons, drop, I don't know, you could say medicine balls, or maybe even something larger, like, I don't know, can't even imagine what. Has anybody seen the movie Indiana Jones? You know the big ball he runs out of the way from? Let's say you drop a bunch of those into the crowd. How would the moving people be able to move it? Not very well. The moving people would bounce off of it and wouldn't really affect its movement much because they're too small to affect the movement of the large thing. That would be like large, really large molecules, things like DNA or some big molecules in the cell. They won't be moved around as easily because the little particles that are causing the diffusion can't move them around. Does that make sense? If you had a really big heavy object and you took a run at it, wouldn't you bounce off of it?
In the example you used, I think.
They'd be crushed by it?
Yeah, I mean, the way you said it was fulfillment.
Well, of course it's unrealistic. I'm trying to explain diffusion by dropping large Indiana Jones spheres into a group of dancing children. It's just wrong, don't you think? All right, this is a little bit of an animation, but I don't want to do it. I think my eloquent explanation in your mind is better than any animation, really. Maybe not. Okay, so diffusion moves particles and things other than water. Water has its own process. And actually, as you write it, well, before I talk about this, I do want to go back to diffusion and explain one important thing because it's very important in the talking about of what osmosis is. So I'll just let you write and then we'll come back the other way. And I do want to draw some images here to help you understand. There's obviously the images there that you didn't draw, but let's draw a couple of images underneath here, one to illustrate diffusion and one to illustrate osmosis so that we can kind of compare and contrast them. And I'm going to draw them on the board for you. So you can put it right underneath this. This is fine. We're talking about diffusion versus osmosis. let me go back and talk about the diffusion one for a moment. If you're not done writing, I'll bring this slide back up in a second. So I just want to go back to diffusion. And I want to draw something kind of like this. I'm going to put it over here. So I'll just call this diffusion. And you can write this down, please. And what we're going to draw in here is a line up the middle to represent the membrane. And we're going to put some holes in it. Okay? And we're going to call this thing a semi-permeable membrane. And what does semi mean in terms of semi-permeable? Any ideas? Partial. Excellent. That's exactly correct. It's partially permeable. Certain things can get through. And it's typically the small things. So now, in order to illustrate this, I do need to kind of describe the fact that we have a bunch of solution in here. So I'm gonna put a little box around this thing. All right? And in here, I'm going to say that this is maybe water or some kind of fluid. Actually, I'll just put here water, and then I'll say fluid. It doesn't have to be water. It could be any fluid. Diffusion works with any fluid, whether it's air, etc., etc. For the cell, it's water. And it's in the blank spaces. And now I'm going to put some particles in here, and I'm just going to use a different color. It doesn't matter what color you use. You could even not have it colored. It's not a problem. I'm just going to put a bunch of dots over here. All right? So these are particles that are diffusing. They could be tea, they could be sodium chloride, it could be salt, it could be oxygen, it could be carbon dioxide. And I'm only going to put a few of them on this side, like that. And this is going to represent low concentration. And this is going to represent high concentration. Just like the tea inside the tea bag and the less tea outside of the tea bag. Which way does the tea move? Out of the tea bag. Because these particles bounce around and they work their way. And so in the end, we have diffusion out of the membrane. All right? We end up with diffusion. The particles will go from high to low until they are completely dispersed. All right? And it happens naturally. You don't have to do anything about it. Right? Again, somebody sprays that axe in the corner of the room. It doesn't take long. That Shane at the back of the room can smell the axe because it slowly gets diffused. All right? Okay. Now for the osmosis. So we're going to have a similar situation here. I'm going to draw it very similar. Osmosis. And again, I'm going to have a box, and I'm going to have that semi-permeable membrane. What color did I make it? Pink. And this time, I'm going to draw the water particles like they did as tiny little white dots. And you could make that, your pencil or whatever. And in this case, that's water. Okay? And I'm going to have some dots over here spread out about the same amount. Okay? Again, this is our semi-permeable membrane. And again, I'm going to take some particles and I'm going to put a bunch of them on the inside. And I got to make them bigger in a different color. I'm in the shadow here and I can't move it. Let's make them orange. let's say these particles are big. So here we have, in this case, here we have high concentration, and here we have low concentration. And in this case, you'll notice I've got it flipped from this, because what osmosis is the movement of water. So the water will actually go in to that scenario. So this is a movement of water. This is water movement. I don't know how to describe this. H2O is moving to the area where there's high concentration. Essentially, the water is spontaneously moving in to equalize the concentrations. All right? So water moves in. H2O, 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 H2O. All right? So in this case, this is particles moving. This isn't water. This is the dissolved particles. I'm not going to write anything in there. I don't want to mess it up. All right? So they're similar things, except one is the movement of particles and one is the movement of water. All right? Before we do that, let me just give you an example of this. Food made up of all kinds of plant cells. If you take the celery, which has lots of water in the cells, right? And let's say you take that celery and you put it in a glass with water, then that water can move into the celery and stay nice and hydrated. You have nice, crisp celery, which is why sometimes when you cut vegetables, you store it in water. Does that make sense? Have you heard of that before? Right? If you take the celery out of the water and you just leave it in the refrigerator where there's lots of air moving, because the refrigerator is always making cold air and it's moving it around, what happens to your celery if you don't have it in water? It goes limp. Because what happens is, outside of the cells, there's no water. And so the water spontaneously moves out of the cells until it becomes kind of dehydrated and it kind of flops over. So that's movement of the water from an area of high of a lot of water to where there's not much water. Another example where you can see osmosis take place. If you're cooking, right, and let's say you cut up some onions, and how many people cook here? Anybody? You guys cook anything? No? Yes? What's that? Hot Pockets? Yeah, no, this wouldn't happen with a Hot Pocket. If you cook and you cut onion and you put it in a pan, and you want to get the onions to wilt so that they're nice and, you know what I mean, soft to put on, say, a burger, what do you put on the onions in order to get that process going? Butter. There's something else you can add to it too. Any ideas? No, water doesn't do it. If you put a little salt on it, it'll draw the water out of the cells. If you put salt on the surface of the onions, you now have very highly concentrated salt on the surface of the onions. And I'm not talking about putting piles on it. Put a little bit on it and you stir it and you've covered them with salt. Then all the water that's inside the cells will be drawn to this area of high concentration, which is outside the cells. And that will cause the onions to go limp. You put a little bit of salt with it, which you're going to end up doing when you flavor it anyway. You draw the moisture out of the cells. You draw it out. All right? And that is osmosis. Okay. Active transport. For example, food may be needed to be pumped in the cell even though the... Yes. Yeah, I wanted you to write down the example. This is when the cell uses energy to actively move substances across the cell membrane. The cell can have certain structures built within the membrane. You can think of them like doors. And you can imagine the doors being employed by, say, a doorman that allows particular things through. Particular molecules, they might be large, so that they don't fit through that semi-permeable membrane, maybe opening a large opening, allowing that thing through. And another reason they might actively transport is to work against diffusion. Let's say we needed to have more substance on the inside than on the out. Diffusion is automatically letting it out, but active transport could grab that particle up and bring it in order to make high concentration on the inside. So those are two examples. Either it's too big, or it's working against the concentration. We call it a concentration gradient, all right? So it's trying to work to make it more concentrated on the inside, instead of diffusion, just letting it go back to the outside. And that takes energy, yep. It takes energy, right? So diffusion happens naturally, just like osmosis. You don't have to do anything for that. It just will happen. You put a ball on the side of the hill, it rolls down spontaneously. So balls rolling down hills, diffusion, and osmosis are all examples of what we would call in science spontaneous. They just happen. You don't have to do anything to it. Active transport, say you wanted to have a higher concentration on the inside of the cell rather than the outside, and you've already got more on the inside, then you're going to have to actively grab it from the outside and put it on the inside, because diffusion wants it to go out naturally. That doesn't happen on its own. Just like if you have a ball at the bottom of the hill and you let it go and you stare at it long enough, it's never going to roll up the hill by itself. So you need to actively take the ball up the hill. Just like the cell needs to actively take the particle from a low concentration and put it into the high concentration. That takes effort, energy from the cell. Yep?
Why would you need it to have more concentration?
That's a good question. And again, I'm not a biologist, so I'm going to give you the best example that I kind of know. All right? I once had to cover a class for Mr. Edgar, and it was about nerve cells. And nerve cells are very interesting things in that they need to have an activation, right? So when you sense something, a nerve cell does something, sends a message to your brain, and you sense it, right? The function in which a nerve cell does that involves moving, I think it's potassium ions, and I don't know whether it's from the outside of the cell to the inside or the inside to the outside of the nerve cell. It's one of the movements. So what happens is, under normal conditions, I think the concentration of these potassium ions in and outside of the cell are the same. And then when the nerve is activated, something happens in the cell that pulls a bunch of the potassium ions to one side of the cell, thus making it really positive either on the in or the outside, I can't remember what it was, and less positive on the other side, all right? And that's active transport. In other words, the cell has to do it. I don't know what causes it. Stimulus obviously does. Let's say you stick your finger in some hot water, stick some finger in your hot water, something triggers that. And then all of a sudden active transport moves all of these ions to make it really concentrated on one side. And this causes a wave of action down the length of the cell as these ions move in. And when the ions move in and the charge gets to the end, it jumps to the next nerve cell, and that continues down the path until it gets to your brain, and your brain does something really cool, and you say, ouch, that's hot water, don't do that anymore. You see what I mean? So that's an example that I know of. I'm sure I explained it incorrectly. If somebody watches my video and they're a biologist, they'll say, no, that's not even close. But it is the idea in the way that kind of functions. You take biology from one of the smarter people in the building, and they'll explain it better than me. But there's an example of why it would do that. Okay? All right? Okay. So, these are not spontaneous happenings, and therefore the cell needs to do something to force it to happen. That's why I say a ball rolling up a hill, because it doesn't happen on its own. You have to actively make the ball roll up the hill, right? If you wanted to, and that's exactly what it is, really. Actually, let me finish this up, or let me describe this one more time. Let's say you had a situation where it was like a game, and it was on a desktop, and it had a bunch of marbles up here, and then you had two areas down here, and you had all these marbles here, right? You had a little fence there, and the game was to get the marbles to spread out. Well, all you have to do is take that away, and the marbles would roll down, and they'd spread all over the place, right? But let's say the game was to pile up all the marbles on the top level, you know, and let's say the top level wasn't even completely level, it was just kind of a little bit level. And let's say your job was to put more at the top than at the bottom. In other words, to win the game, you had to have more marbles at the top than at the bottom. You'd be busy, wouldn't you? Because they'd all slowly roll down, and you'd be busy picking the marbles and putting them back to the top, because they're always going to want to roll down the hill. Diffusion is like the spontaneous rolling down the hill. These high concentrations are going to always spontaneously go out. But if you wanted to have it opposite so that you've got high concentration, you need to actively take them and put them back in the other side. And that's what active transport does. The cell actively takes them and brings them back to the other side, where diffusion is always working to have it spread out and be nice and even. So active transport works against what nature wants to happen by itself. All right? Okay. We're going to write this one down as well. And I don't even know how to draw that. I'm not sure how to draw that. So I talked about the fact that it could be to bring ions on the inside, or it could be for moving larger molecules. So you've got some really big molecules. I don't even know what they could be. They could be, you know, maybe a protein or something made somewhere else, or maybe even hormones in a certain part of the body that are needed in certain cells. They've got to be brought into the cells. Then there are these structures within the cell membrane. This represents the cell membrane. And these structures, the pieces can fit in. I don't even know how you would even draw that. So now you could make a reference of it, because this is online. So you could say see the note or whatever it is. It would be under today's date, December 3rd, or however you want to do it. You don't have to necessarily draw it. But they essentially carry them in. Okay. Yeah, sometimes they're called pumps, right? Because they like pumping water, they move it from outside to in. All right, don't need to write this down. So let's try to imagine what's taking place here. So we've got a few water molecules here. These are representing water molecules. These spheres are representing maybe big protein molecules, right? Just like the spheres here, they could be these big protein molecules. And the cell needs to bring the proteins in. So these are big protein molecules being transported into the cell. So what kind of transport would this be representing? Yep. Passive? Not if they're big protein molecules. Yep. Yeah, this is active, and this is the facilitated transport, except we didn't draw in the nice, tiny little, the nice, tiny little membrane. Here's the membrane right here. So this is essentially this membrane right along here. This is our membrane with the things being moved in. So that was supposed to represent a active transport, actually facilitated transport. Let's take a look at this one. So here we've got a cell, and these are representing oxygen molecules. And I've got lots of oxygen on the outside of the cell. My arrow is indicating that these oxygen molecules are moving inside the cell. What kind of transportation are we talking about here, Shane? Yeah, this is diffusion, because it's the movement of not water, but of dissolved substances from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And that would happen just naturally. So if you were to surround some cells with lots of oxygen, that oxygen would automatically move into the cells. All right? That's what happens when you take a breath. When you take a deep breath and bring all that oxygen into your lungs, that oxygen gets put around the red blood cells, and the oxygen automatically diffuses into the red blood cells, where then it can be taken to the rest of the body. And it just happens all on its own. And here we've got a cell of some sort. All right, here we've got a cellular membrane. This could be like a cell wall. This could be maybe a plant cell. And here we've got the nucleus and maybe some chloroplasts. Here we've got some water inside the vacuole, and then lots of water outside of the cell. And here we've got water that is then moving inside to this cell. So what do we have taking place here if that water, which there's lots of on the outside, is moving to the inside of the cell? What do we call that process? Kendall? It's osmosis, the movement of water from an area where there is lots of water to an area where there's less water, but it's highly concentrated. So it moves in. Excellent. That is osmosis. And that's the end of the presentation. There is a little question sheet that goes with it. It is online. I do not have answers to this because it is more of a description thing. So before we get going on our labs tomorrow, we will take these up together. All right? I don't need big paragraphs of this. You can explain this, kind of in point form, because it's not like a big test or anything. Yep. Yes, you can. And we'll stop right there. If you have that piece of paper, you can start to answer those. Yeah, you can. They're right over there because I've got my tea over there, so you can just help yourself to an iPad. And I'm going to stop the recording here.